Solidarity Movement to be able to speak to you tonight. I want to first salute our leadership, my leadership, Omali Yeshitela, for the 50 years of relentless revolutionary leadership. Without that, I don't think any of us would be here on this webinar tonight. So I just really appreciate that. And I also want to salute Ona Zanaya Yeshitela, who has coordination over 50 economic institutions that saw earlier in the slides, the different economic institutions of the Uhuru movement, which is no small task at all. And it represents, African people move for self-government and self-determination. And I just really appreciate both of their leadership. And, talking about the 80s tonight and the Measure O, Measure H campaign that occurred during that time is more than waxing nostalgia. It is a way to talk about what self-determination of African people looked like then, some 30 years ago, and bringing it to what African self-determination looks like today in 2023. And it's all about housing, feeding and clothing ourselves as a people. And like I said, creating self-government, self-determination, something that African people have not known for centuries. But I do really appreciate the fact that we're talking about Oakland tonight. I wasn't born in Oakland, but I've been raised in Oakland the majority of my life. And I've been fortunate to be here during the time that the Black Panther Party was on the ground as a young man during my formative years. I've been fortunate to be a part of this Uhuru movement for the last 30 years or so, and to be a part of the continued fight for African self-determination. There's a lot of people who I've went to school with here in Oakland who are not part of the Uhuru movement, people who do see me on the streets. And I think when I do run across people such as I did this last week at one of the street fairs that Uhuru Foods and Pies was at, constantly run into people. And I think it's a winning thing where people can see me still doing something, representing a Black community from 20, 30 years ago, and still see me getting gray hair when I didn't have gray hair. I think it's really a victory for people to see that. And I think it's a way to keep that in the forefront and to win people to this. And I just think that when I look back at Oakland in the 80s, I think about Measure H and Measure O, which were brilliant strategies of the party. And it was part of the campaign, again, when the African working class back in the political prior to Oakland being the headquarters of the African People's Socialist Party, that we saw Huey Newton and the Black Panther Party here on the ground prior to the United States government military assault through COINTELPRO, where we saw young Bobby Hutton murdered in the streets of West Oakland 2 days after Martin Luther King was murdered in Memphis, Tennessee, at this vicious military assault on African freedom, where we saw a military defeat suffered by our movement. And Oakland particularly was hit hard because Oakland was one of those places that we saw revolution being raised up. We saw organization on the ground. We saw a newspaper being put out there, and we saw the masses of African people rising up. And that was a threat to the status quo. So, of course, the government had to do, the only thing that was left for them was to wage a very vicious military assault against our people. And it was after this period that the African People's Socialist Party came into Oakland in the early 80s. And it was a time when there was a majority African city council. It had a Black mayor and a majority city council government. It was when neocolonialism reigned supreme in Oakland. And the party had intentions of breaking up the class peace that existed in Oakland prior to or after the military defeat of the Black Revolution of the 60s that was best represented through the Black Panther Party. And it was the Uhuru movement that came in and did lay out a plan that busted up that class peace. as the video said, that the first party Congress was held in Oakland, California in the early 80s. And it was through that Congress that a lot of the work that was laid out for the next upcoming period. The work for the party from 1972 prior to that period was considered wartime work, where the party built itself out of the COINTELPRO defeat. And that first Congress gave us the stability and put us on the trajectory where we are today, where we've just had our seventh Congress of the African People's Socialist Party and are looking toward the eighth. And these Congresses are extremely important towards summing up our work of where we've come from and projecting our work and where we're going. And it's pretty much the similar work that we've been doing for so long in the struggle for self-determination. But getting back to the thing about Oakland, Oakland is particular because of the large working class community historically in Oakland. Oakland is known for the ship a day that it built for Kaiser Steel in the 1940s. Oakland was once a place where Oakland, because of the African workers going to these places like these shipyards, African men at one point in time in Oakland had the highest incidence of prostate cancer in the world. We see health statistics today where are no different, where African children live a life 15 years less than white people in the same city. We see these very stark differences, these disparities in health, education, and healthcare. And these are the things that the Uhuru movement took on in the 1980s. And Measure O was one of those such campaigns. Measure O came out of the 1984 summer project in Oakland, California. This summer project was a reliving of the 1964 summer project that we saw SNCC carry out in the southern states, where we heard about how people were brought from the northern states to come down to help with the civil rights movement. And we had a similar thing in Oakland where we brought people from throughout the US and even from the UK. We had brought forces there, and we had waged a serious campaign around the housing struggle. We built a camp in downtown Oakland. We renamed it, it was a tent city where we fed homeless people, and we renamed it Uhuru Park. I remember as a young kid, we called it Old Man's Park, but Uhuru movement renamed it Uhuru Park. And we saw the police department under the leadership of the city government attack our abilities to put the homeless question out in the world. There was over 14,000 abandoned houses in Oakland at the time and 10,000 homeless people. And we had organized around houses for the homeless. And we came up into some really stiff opposition from the city government, from large corporations like Kaiser Steel, the Kaiser Corporation, the Kaiser family, which is one of the bigger corporations still here in Oakland. Also the Kaiser and Clorox, which was a large corporation here at that time. And these are some of the major oppositions that we had with Measure O in 1984. And what we did, we put on the ballot an initiative, a housing initiative where we needed to have at least 17,000 votes that we have won and got it on the ballot. Even though they tried to sabotage that process, we got it through, and it was a great victory leaving City Hall, knowing that the African working class had got this initiative on the ballot, and not only got that initiative on the ballot, but relentlessly during the campaign, got over 300,000 pieces of literature out to the people. Although the initiative did not win, we won at least 25% of the vote. And as the video stated, 29,000 people had voted for it. It was a great victory in 1984 with the Measure O. And it really wasn't a city charter amendment. And, you know, it was to divide Oakland into 12 distinct districts with 25% of the rent average of the median income for all the residents. If you lived in a district that had high rent, high income, the income was 25%, your rent was 25% of that median income. So, and that thing that really made that whole initiative so interesting is that it was where the landlords would fund the boards. And the boards were made up of people in the community itself, that the district boards had the right to condemn and to claim eminent domain, to buy apartments vacant for over 6 months. And again, the landlords would fund that by paying $60 for every residential unit that they owned. And in 1984, that was $4.5 million. The city of Oakland itself was obliged to give the property tax proceeds, which was about 1% of the city budget, which amounted to $300,000. And this was really a great victory to have this initiative on the ballot. And again, the opposition that came from these corporations, from the neo-colonial city government, from a lot of influential preachers, the lines of delineation were very clear. It was the African working class against these other forces. And Measure O was, again, a couple years prior to Measure H, which was a similar housing initiative that was put forth in 1986. And the primary differences between Measure H and Measure O is Measure H in 1986 primarily dealt with 9 districts instead of 12 for the community boards. And it included the commercial component, where over 80% of the commercial property in the city of Oakland was owned by landlords who did not live in the city of Oakland. And it was this work at this time in Oakland that really laid out the whole framework of how the African working class needed to take on the struggles that we recently saw in Oakland a few years ago, where there was an action in West Oakland where there was a seizure of a house, something that the Uhuru movement had did back in 1984. And it is just groundbreaking work. It is work led by the African People's Socialist Party and the Uhuru movement. And it was something that, you know, the Oakland years, during the early years of the African People's Socialist Party at Oakland, played a large role in how we see the party movement today with building the economic institutions that we see here in Oakland. We see Uhuru Foods and Pies, and we see Uhuru Collectibles, Uhuru Furniture and Collectibles, 2 of the oldest and more successful institutions. And we see that building these institutions took our work beyond protest. It took it to a place where we are building dual and contending power institutions to begin to look towards self-government, similar to what we saw 100 years ago with the UNIA and the movement of the Marcus Garvey era. And today we see in Oakland, California, the Uhuru House still standing in the East Oakland, still representing the Fight Back Center for the African working class. We have work to do to bring political life back to the African working class. But over the last 30 years, the Uhuru movement has been a fantastic beacon. I think I saw a presentation recently where the chairman was talking about how people came to see Farrakhan at the Oakland Coliseum. They paid a lot of money, paid a lot of thousands of dollars to go see Farrakhan. And you know, they did it as they go, like they were going to go see the OJs. It was for entertainment purposes. But when people were murdered, when the police brutality occurred in Oakland, when the housing question became untenable, when the healthcare question would need to be dealt with, it was people who came to the Uhuru movement and the Uhuru House to take on these kinds of issues. So I think the history of the party in Oakland speaks for itself. I don't want to be too redundant because I thought the video did a great job, and that we still are relentless with this work that we carry out today. And I want to stop there because I know I'm beginning to ramble, but I just really appreciate being able to be here to say a few words about Measure H, Measure O, and the city of Oakland and the work that we've been doing here. And it's good to know that we are going to have the chairman here in a few weeks in the DREP event, and looking forward to it. And I hope that we bring the house out to capacity. Uhuru.
Uhuru, thank you so much, Comrade Rep. Bakri, for that presentation, and just hearing about that history. I know that has informed, the work of the party to just keep building, like you said, like the initiative, just on every front, the Uhuru movement has waged these different campaigns around community control. And then, along with that, building institutions like Uhuru Furniture, Uhuru Foods and Pies, and now, Black Star Industries, Black Power Blueprint. And yeah, it's incredible to hear that history and just put it in context, because the Oakland that we see now sometimes is unrecognizable, to what Oakland was during those years of not only, going back to the Black Panther birth of the Black Panther Party in 1966, but the height of like the party's work and the forces of, of colonialism, have been really intense in Oakland, and coming down and forcing African people out of Oakland, which was a majority Black city. And now you have about, well, I have this statistic here. I'm so sorry. I just have to look at my other screen, but Black residents currently make up just 20% of Oakland's population, which is 47% down from 1980. So that, that's chilling. That gives me the chills, because so that means that there were 67% of Oakland's population, was African at one time. And certainly I know like the living history of it just from my own family, and just seeing like the way that, white settler colonialism operates, and how, so many people coming back into Oakland to get the whatever tech jobs, and this whole, Jerry Brown, of course, the Uhuru movement led a campaign that I was involved in I believe that was the 90s, challenging Jerry Brown's, gentrification plan. And what we've seen, since that time of the 80s and 90s is just record, record numbers of people who don't have housing. And this stat I wanted to point out was Oakland recorded an 83% increase in homelessness from 2017 to 2022. So just 5 years, 87% increase. And that it says Black or African Americans, this is a quote from an article. So African people represent 60% of those people, so that means that if there's 5,000 people living without homes in Oakland, there's 3,000 African people that, are without homes in Oakland. And I'm glad you brought up some of the recent struggles, because I think, around like the Moms for Housing, because I think, that's part of this continuum of, people seeing the example of the party and fighting back. Those are some things I wanted to say about that. And I wanted to bring up our next speaker, which is Comrade Maureen Wagner, who chairs Uhuru Foods and Pies and is a member of the African People Solidarity Committee, and was around during that time too. So feel free to chime in about that work. Thank you for being here. And do you want me to pull up your presentation?
Sure, thank you. Just want to make sure everybody can hear me first. I know my mic does weird things sometimes. So Uhuru, yes, I was around during parts of the Measure O campaign. I was in the Uhuru movement, but the Uhuru movement was also in New York and Florida and other places. And I just wanted to say, in terms of reparations, in terms of that particular work, it was a battle. That Measure O and Measure H was a battle, and it was really important that white people were involved in it. White people have a stake in having a better way of living, better rents, etc. but there was really white nationalist attacks on the Uhuru movement and on Measure O, including a graphic that was done that showed like an African person in a grass skirt in a hut, and that was supposed to be what the housing councils were supposed to be, as opposed to the really humane work that the party was doing to provide housing for the people, for African people. And just to say that the landlords on Measure O spent $500,000, this was in 1984, $500,000 on their campaign against Measure O. The Uhuru movement only had $7,000. So when Bakri's talking about 300 pieces of literature being distributed, that was distributed on foot by hand. African working class people and people in solidarity actually literally walking door to door throughout Oakland and putting it on the doorstep, because there was no money for stamps, there was no money for the mailman, or there was no internet at the time. So, it was really a people's movement. And so when we were out on the street getting signatures for Measure H, one of our most important pieces of work was to get donations as well for the campaign itself. And while we're getting signatures, we're like, okay, we want to get X number of dollars for each signature that we get. I actually had a station that I did often, which was on Piedmont, which is a very, very white area. And people were actually very supportive. And even when people would say, oh, I already gave, we would just say, well, look, this is what the landlords do. This is a people's movement. And people would give again and would sign and give again. And it was really important to add the commercial aspect to the Measure H, because literally, if a lease expired on a commercial property in that period, the landlord who lived someplace outside of Oakland would triple the new rent. So that meant that businesses that had been in business for decades in Oakland closed down and disappeared. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that in terms of reparations, and go on to the next slide, because reparations is the essential question of our times. Next slide. And I just want to salute Chairman Omali Yeshitela and the African People's Socialist Party, who have made reparations a household word. If you know the word reparations in relationship to African people in the US, you learned it from Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Next slide. And I want to salute Deputy Chair Ona Zenaye Yeshitela, who's the leader of all the economic work, including Uhuru Foods and Pies, which I had the honor of working in, and the Black Power Blueprint, which I'm going to talk about a little bit and talk about its relationship to the housing situation that Rep. Bakri just spoke about. Next slide. And I want to salute APSP Western Regional Rep. Bakri Olatunji, who you just heard a lot about. I am really fortunate because I get to work with him baking and selling pies, which is not just a transactional thing. It is about economic development, power in the hands of the African working class, and community organizing. We're out in the community. You can see we're at a table here. This was at an event downtown Oakland, and we did not stop during COVID. So I want to salute Rep. Bakri, Uhuru, and really appreciate that presentation. And next slide. And I also want to salute Chairwoman Penny Hess, who is my direct leadership in the solidarity work, and a courageous woman who was the first person who's really understood what reparations was under the leadership of Chairman Omali Yeshitela and the African People's Socialist Party. And just to say, APSC and USM are organizations of the African People's Socialist Party. It's a brilliant strategy to deal with the question, what about the white people? And Jesse Neville, who is the third part of the Uhuru 3, is Chairman Omali Yeshitela, Chairwoman Penny Hess, and Jesse Neville. Jesse has brilliantly built the Uhuru Solidarity Movement, and there's so many amazing people in Uhuru Solidarity Movement. So next slide. So yes, the African People's Socialist Party made reparations a household word. This was in Oakland, and this was way back. This was back in the 70s, I think. This was even before, maybe 81 at the latest. So reparations now, that was the demand, not later, not let's do a research project or let's study it or something like that, or pass a housing bill. Now, reparations. Next slide. So one of the most important strategies of the reparations work was this 1982 World Tribunal. This is on a stage in New York City, actually in Brooklyn. And the party used international law and international panel of jurists and heard tremendous testimony from African people who had been involved in the Black Power movement of the 1960s and 70s, as well as individuals in the community, and made the case that the US committed genocide against African people, that African people are due reparations, and at that time, the number only for labor was $4.1 trillion, 1982 dollars, no damages, no other stuff, just labor, and that the US was in violation of international law, which actually is currently only in the hands of formal states, but this was the Black working class taking this law into its own hands. Next slide. So again, the party created APSC and USM as a strategic front of the African liberation movement. So behind enemy lines, people mentioned in the video about behind enemy lines in the prisons, we're the Black movement behind enemy lines in the white community. And we understand that it's in our interest to be a part of this movement. Next slide. So again, the assignment of APSC was reparations. It's like we heard the 3 principles of unity of USM at the beginning of this. We do work in the white community. We raise the question of African liberation in the white community, and we understand that the resources are there. Next slide. So capitalism was born parasitic. The world economy is built on the colonial mode of production. As Chairman Omali Yeshitela has said, it's colonialism that built capitalism, and it's going to be colonialism that's going to destroy it. Next slide. In 1415, Europe assaulted Africa and enslaved African people. That was part of that beginning of the colonial mode of production. Next slide. Stolen African labor produced the greatest economic wealth in human history in the whole Western Hemisphere, and it was on stolen indigenous land. So if you want to start with the question of homelessness, you start with the question that Africans were stolen from their home, brought to a land that was stolen from indigenous people. That's the beginning of homelessness. So next slide. So today, African people face police violence and terror as a result of this colonial mode of production, this history. Next slide. In terms of homelessness plaguing African people, I have some stats. Also is that Black people represent only, and excuse the typo, represent 13% of the US population, but 39% nationally of homeless people. 50% of the homeless people that have children are African, and Africans are 4 times more likely to be homeless than whites. And they say that factors that lead to homelessness include incarceration, which we know the prison system has been used brutally against the African community, poverty, which goes back to the question of parasitism and the colonial mode of production, that all the wealth goes into the white community and it's at the expense of African people, and lack of health care is another reason, because healthcare is a commodity and is only for profit. And if you have anything happen to you, you end up completely in debt. You might lose your whole home and everything. So, and I just wanted to say, in terms of the situation in Oakland, that some of the statistics that Wendy just mentioned, something like 60 to 80% of the homeless in Oakland were previous homeowners. And that's something that's like, covered up. And the whole thing that happened with the special mortgages, the redlining, et cetera, was also part of taking away those homes. Next slide. So all of this is colonialism. Colonialism is a practice by which one people controls another people, generally for strategic and economic advancement. And that's what African people experienced in the US. Next slide. If Measure O or Measure H had passed in Oakland, it would have put control of housing into the hands of African people in Oakland, setting a trend for African self-determination. We would not see the conditions for African people that we see today, where housing is not a human right, but a means of wealth extraction. And in fact, today, Oakland and San Francisco have both some of the highest property rates in the country, costs in the country, and the highest homelessness in the country. I saw a study the other day, the 50 worst cities to live in by data. And the number one, believe it or not, was San Francisco because of homelessness. Next slide. So the Black Power Blueprint, I'm really excited to talk about this. There's a lot of parallels between what the African People's Socialist Party through its organizations of Burning Black Star Industries and the African People's Education is doing in St. Louis. Bakri mentioned that there was 10,000 empty buildings in Oakland when Measure O was ran. In St. Louis, there's a land bank that's owned by the city that has 10,000 abandoned properties. And most of those are in the African community, and they are left there to rot as part of demoralization of the African community. Conditions today, 60% of Black St. Louis lives at or below the poverty level, 18-year gap in life expectancy, just like in Oakland, just like in other places in the country. And infant mortality deaths in St. Louis could populate 15 kindergarten classes. The majority of that is African, so at least 12 of those kindergarten classrooms would be only African children who die every year. And that's before the first year of birth. Next slide. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch did an article on the Black is Back, they called it, but it was on the Black Power Blueprint and really praised it and did a fantastic article. On the next slide, part of the work of the Uhuru movement has been to seize territory, to have land for the African community. So this is Ona Zanea Shatella and some of the workers. And this is what these abandoned buildings look like that are all over the Black community of North St. Louis and owned by the city, who does not fix them up, who does not make them available to the community, who does not tear them down. But the Uhuru movement bought these properties and tore them down and built something. Next slide. The first project was, and this creates political and economic power for the African working class. So next slide, and then you can skip past that one after people read it. This is the Uhuru House Community Center. This is what the building looked like inside. This was actually a privately owned building, but no floors. You see them looking through the floors, no ceiling, some walls down. You can see right out the back of the building there. Next slide. This is what it looks like in the hands of the African working class. This is the first project of the Black Power Blueprint. It was close to $200,000 and only took 10 months to do. And if Black working class poor people and their allies can do this, why can't the government? Next slide. The next project was the Caribou Outdoor Event Space in Gary Brooks Community Garden. Next slide. Again, these were the buildings that were across the street from the Uhuru House. The Uhuru movement paid a Black contractor to tear them down and save all the bricks. And then it was an open space and built the event space, which I want to show you in the next slide. And that's the stage before it was painted, which maybe we'll see another slide. See the garden boxes and see the paving. And then the next slide, you can see like how many people work in the garden plant, the beautiful African flag. You got solidarity forces working with Africans to end food apartheid by having this garden and have a space where people can feel safe and be outside and have pride and unity through that African flag. Next slide. The next project was a Black Power Vanguard's community basketball court. Next slide. Again, more abandoned buildings. These were commercial buildings. They were literally, the bricks were literally falling on people's heads. They had to come down. And so the plan, next slide, was to build the community basketball court because the youth were playing basketball on the street and they're like, we need a court. The city was closing down the courts that existed in the parks and making sure that African children didn't play in the white parks. So Ona Zanea Shatella said, it's not just about building a basketball court, it's rebuilding our community. Next slide. This is what that property looks like now, where those buildings were being torn down, falling on people's heads. Next slide. Richard Muffundi Lake African Independence Workforce Housing. Next slide. This is a fourplex that is next door to the basketball court. Right now, you can see those old fallen down buildings next to it, but it's next to the basketball court. 4 apartments that are going to be used to house people coming out of prison who are going to be working in various aspects of the Uhuru movement. Next slide. And the Uhuru movement brought from its institution in Philadelphia, Uhuru Furniture, the most beautiful furniture. If you see the insides of these buildings, these are places people are going to want to live. When you come out of prison and go into what they call transitional housing or whatever, it doesn't look that much different than what it looked like in a prison. These look like houses. You can come home, you can cook a dinner, you can share a conversation with the other people who are in the building. Next slide. And they're named after African heroes. Desi Woods, who we heard about, Sundiata Kohli, Matula Shakur, and Asada Shakur. And the whole building is named after Mafundi Lake, who was an organizer in Alabama, who died about 5 years ago. There was a dedication ceremony about 2 months ago, or I'm sorry, about a month and a half ago. And his wife was there and his daughters were there. Next slide. Next slide. That's fine. Yeah. So this is the Solidarity Center. This is in the white community. This is owned by Black Star Industries. I think we saw some of these pictures a little earlier, but that sign, Uhuru Solidarity Center, Unity Through Reparations, is on a main street in St. Louis that people drive by all day long. Next slide. And this is the grand opening of it. Next slide. And the Solidarity Movement does reparations work from that, and it's part of the material solidarity with Black Power Blueprint. Next slide. So now there's more programs being built as part of an entire strategy to empower the community. There's the Black Power Square Retail Complex and Business Development Center, more buildings coming down because you can't live in them, you can't work in them, you can't have a business in them. This is going to have cargo containers on it. If you take the next slide, you can see an example in Chicago of what it can look like and have businesses. It can have Uhuru Foods and Pies, it can have clothing, it can have food products that people make. So that's the next project that's going to be built. This is all in one area of North St. Louis. A whole community is being transformed, which leads to people wanting to stay in their houses in that community and fix their houses and come and live in that community. Next slide. African Women's Clinic. Next slide. This is going to be a place for Black women. Well, just a statistic, again, Black women with a college education is 60% greater risk for maternal death, herself dying during childbirth, than a white woman who only finished high school or less than high school. Next slide. Uhuru Foods and Pies in Uhuru Chico. Next slide. This building is a little bit further away from those other buildings. It's a gorgeous building that's going to have an incredible cafe and bakery unit in it. The next slide shows the layout of it and what it can look like. It's going to have a cafe in the front curved part where you can sit down and talk to your friends and have good food, healthy food. It's going to have a kitchen where people can bake, and it's going to have a production kitchen, a manufacturing kitchen to bake pies, cookies, bread, etc. That's going to be part of the economic development of Uhuru. Next slide. African Independence Workforce Program. This is key to everything. To reverse the negative economic impact of the colonial economy and prison system, the African Independence Workforce Program is training members of our African community to contribute to a prosperous future through development of our independent, liberated economy. So next few slides, reparations is tied to political and economic power in the hands of the African working class. Next slide. Reparations is African working class redistributing the wealth of the world that was stolen through the process that we talked about beginning in 1415 and even earlier. Next slide. Genuine solidarity and reparation enhances the parties and capacity to take and hold power. So this is becoming liberated territory, a community that is liberated, manages these programs, etc. Next slide. Reparations is not charity. It's a revolutionary demand. It's in our interest. If we want to be united with the people of the world, we have a place that we can take and be proud of it. Next slide. Black Star Industries is the big economic wing that we're talking about that DREP is going to support. And these are some of the programs that are actually part of Black Star Industries. Wendy avoided using the word conglomerate earlier. I can't even say it. And but this is some of the subsidiaries of this. So currently it's just a way to have economic development in the hands of African people. And last slide. Uhuru Solidarity Movement is growing throughout the US. under the leadership of Chairman Omali Yeshitela, the African People's Socialist Party. And these DREPs are a really important part of the work to win reparations and win others like ourselves who believe in reparations to be a part of organization under the leadership of the African working class. Uhuru.
Uhuru. Wow, Comrade Maureen, that was a great tour through history, as well as a tour through the Black Power Blueprint, Black Star Industry programs. And I just really thank you very much for that. And I think that, you know, there were some people on our committee that were asking kind of like for a tour, and you gave the tour of what we're raising reparations for. So I really, really appreciate that presentation.
I just want to say again, that's genius of Onizine Yeshitela.
Yes.
Who
absolutely.
is the head of the African economy. That's all I can say, you know, and the head of most of our solidarity work. So
Uhuru. All right, so I'll just keep it moving. I want to bring up Chair Jesse Neville, who I just really want to appreciate his stance and his leadership. And he's going to talk about our fundraising, because that's really what this is about. We know that the question of housing is tied to the question of life for African people, and that our stance in solidarity with African people has to be about, you know, this fundraising and returning the stolen resources. So I'm just going to turn it over to Jesse. Thank you.
Uhuru, Wendy, thank you so much. I'm going to keep this very brief. I was going to show a few slides, but it would actually be redundant because it was all covered so comprehensively in the previous presentations. And I really, really want to salute both of those presentations. That was very powerful, very informative, very inspiring. Just really appreciate Western Regional Rep Bakri Olatunji and Comrade Maureen Wagner for those presentations. And I am sort of just adding on to or uniting with and reinforcing what Maureen was laying out in terms of the stand of reparations to African people from the white community, as expressed in the form of material solidarity with the work of the Uhuru movement to build the independent, anti-colonial African working class economy. And this is what Black Star Industries represents. This is what Chairman Omali Yeshitela and Deputy Chair Onizine Yeshitela and the African People's Socialist Party are building. And as was mentioned, and you saw the whole history of it in that video and in Rep Bakri's presentation, that this has deep roots going back decades in what Chairman Omali Yeshitela calls dual and contending power, building power to govern in the hands of the African working class that contends with the oppressive power of the US colonial state. And I just have a quote here from Deputy Chair Onizine Yeshitela. She says, Black Star Industries promises a future for African people, not just a job. Every African around the world will be a part of Black Star Industries because the future of African people depends on their ability to have an economy primarily designed to take care of Black people first and foremost. And as Maureen said, this is not charity. It addresses the fundamental underlying contradiction responsible for homelessness and poverty and all of the conditions imposed on African people. And that's what we have the ability to be a part of when we pay reparations, when we join the Uhuru Solidarity Movement. We become connected to a struggle to overturn the conditions of colonialism. So this is what the Days of Reparations to African People campaign is all about. It's not just about winning support for reparations as some kind of sentiment. It's about actually implementing reparations in practice, reparations in action. And the overall Days of Reparations to African People campaign this year, which has events in 5 cities, has a national collective pledge of $30,000 in reparations for the work of Black Star Industries. And the Oakland event is part of that and is raising resources towards that overall goal. So we want to encourage people to make a pledge. If we can raise even $300 or $500 in this meeting tonight towards the overall pledge, you can either make that donation today by going to uhurusolidarity.org/pay-reparations, which I will put in the chat, or you can bring your reparations contribution with you to the event on October 2nd and make your contribution that night as part of the overall call for reparations. And I want to close this out by saying that one of the things that Chairman Omali Yeshitela has really fought for us to understand is that in this period, reparations to Black Star Industries is a stand in defense of free speech. It is a stand in defense of the highest form of free speech and democratic rights for African people, which is the fight for self-determination, the fight to speak to each other, communicate with each other in order to build economic development and self-reliance institutions that uplift and empower the African working class without fear of reprisal or punishment by the US government. And these are the programs that have come under attack by the FBI, by the US government. It's not just what the party and the chairman say that has brought down the repressive arm of the US colonial state. It's also what the party is doing, actually building programs to empower and win power and build power in the hands of African people. So supporting, defending, and protecting Black Star Industries is more urgent than ever. And when you support Black Star Industries, you are standing against the US government's repression, its intrusion into the lives of the people, its attacks on the ability for African and oppressed people to speak and organize in their own interests. And you are taking a stand for all power to the people, Black power to the African nation. And that is what reparations means for us. So I want to thank Comrade Maureen. Wow, okay, look at this. So we got people in the chat here. Stephanie, who's saying, I will donate $50. For Stephanie. Comrade Wendy matching that $50. Maureen saying, I have a pledge already. Tonight I will donate an additional $50. So that's $150 right there. So I want to encourage people to do that as well. Janine says, I unite with white people paying reparations. $20 tonight for Janine. So that's $170. So let's keep that going. You can let us know in the chat or just go straight to uhurusolidarity.org/pay-reparations. So that's pretty much what I'll say for now. And I'll turn it back over to you, Comrade Wendy. And just really want to salute this event. I learned a lot. It was very moving and very powerful, and just really salute the presentations.
Uhuru, thank you, Jesse, and thanks to everybody thanks first to Stephanie who got that ball rolling. Raising $170. Hey, that's amazing, and just really want to call on people. I think there's a couple people watching on Facebook. Call on you to donate, to give reparations as well. I think that's a request to put the link to donate in the chat. Is that right? We can do that in just a sec. So, we are doing all kinds of things to raise reparations, selling baked goods, yard sales, getting out on the street and just talking to people, asking them to take the pledge of reparations. There's so many ways to do that. And all right, we're at $220 with Karpani's $50 pledge tonight. Uhuru Karpani. We're so sad that you can't come down to Oakland, but you will be there in spirit. Right on, says Jesse. Right on, Uhuru Karpani. All right. So just keep the energy going. One thing about reparations is that it is, I found, people, I have so much excitement for this movement for reparations. And I think you can feel that because there's such a depth to it. It's about truly changing the world that we live in, the way we think. It's about what the party says, turning the world right side up. So let's build that momentum towards October 2nd, when we're going to be able to host the Uhuru 3, and that's going to be very moving. And next, I want to just share a promo for the Black People's March on the White House. So here we go. Uh-oh, not sure what happened. I played it earlier.
Let me see if I can pull that one up.
I might need your help. Thank you, Chair Jesse.
All right, I got it. This is November 4th, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Uhuru, this is Margaret Kimberly. All out on Saturday, November 4th for the 15th annual Black People's March on the White House, sponsored by the Black is Back Coalition. Drop the charges on Omali Yeshitela, chairman of the African People's Socialist Party, leader of the Uhuru movement. On July 29, 2022, the FBI launched pre-dawn raids on 7 properties of the Uhuru movement in 2 cities using assault weapons, flashbang grenades, and drones. The chairman and 2 others, known as the Uhuru 3, have been indicted by the U.S. government and face federal charges. Chairman Yeshitela has said, "The FBI wants to put me on trial for fighting for Black freedom. Put the colonial state on trial, we will win." An attack on free speech for Chairman Omali Yeshitela is an attack on everyone's free speech. March under the banner of the anti-colonial free speech movement. Register for the Black People's March on the White House on Saturday, November 4th at blackpeoplesmarch.com or go to handsoffuhuru.org. Drop the charges against the Uhuru 3 and power to the people.
Uhuru. So I just want to call on people, to think about how you're going to get to Washington, D.C. and the Black People's March on the White House. That is going to be a very powerful event. And not just that, it's going to really, raise up this question of free speech coming from the anti-colonial movement. So, I think now we have time to open things up for questions. And I see that there's a question in the chat, or Janet, if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, I need maybe a half an hour or something. A lot of questions. I mean, this was wonderful. I learned a whole lot. I'm coming to all this with fresh eyes. So I don't know where to start. I mean, how much time would I have?
Why don't you just get started and we'll see. I think we had allotted a couple hours for this event. I know some people
okay.
not be able to stay that long. So we had initially put an hour and a half, but I think it's important that you ask your questions. So we'll see. So
Okay.
why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, because I assumed it was going to end at 8:30. All right. So, I mean, again, most of it is new to me. So, and I think for most of you, it's not. And so the terminology and the whole, history, it's kind of, I don't have that. I hear the phrase building the African working class economy. And that's a huge bunch of words. so what comes to mind is what, aside from what you showed about St. Louis and those projects and over decades, and amazing. What comes to mind is it looks like gentrification. And to me, I associate gentrification not just with capitalism. I mean, and it's not your projects are not capitalist, I assume, but I'm not sure how that all works. I mean, like if you have cafes or whatever, is it for profit and all that? And so that's part of what I wonder about. Another thing has to do with
Do you want to just take that question first? Because I think that's a really good question to start with.
okay.
Who would like to take that for our speakers?
I wasn't quite clear on what the question was.
Well, the aim or the goal is to build the African working class economy. And so is that going to look like what gentrification looks like, except it's not going to be for, it's going to be for the African working class and not for developers or whoever has been doing gentrification? How is it different from gentrification?
One, again, I think we talk about the question of self-determination, and we have to look at, African people in terms of what we had before colonialism destroyed African life. That African people, there was no concept for prisons or jails or welfare. That African people did not have foreign and alien should I say, imposition on our lives, and that subsequent to the attack on Africa, primarily through Europe, we found that African people have not had that. So in terms of what it would look like moving forward, it would look like African people having that ability once again to determine our own destiny, to build our own economy. And that would mean that it'd be Black community control of the schools, Black community control of education. It would be where a situation that exists now, it would mean the end of gentrification. It would not be a case where it would be Black gentrification. It would be an end to someone developing your land, displacing your people. We see today the results of gentrification right here in Oakland. I think somebody talked about an 83% jump in homelessness in 5 years here in Oakland. It was unheard of during the time I grew up. And when we look at it, so when we talk about African self-determination, we're just talking about, again, the ability to house, clothe, and feed ourselves without the dependency on the colonial mode of production that we've been forced to exist under. And I don't know if I did your question any justice, Uhuru.
Thank you. Well, again, so Black control, Black community control of schools, etc. What that could look like is a small number of Blacks who have money, who control these entities that and the other Blacks who don't have money or whatever wouldn't have power. How do you not have that kind of like hierarchy?
So I can address some of that, Janet, if that's okay, Bakri.
Please.
Well, first of all, everything that you see that we call gentrification, that was built by Black people. And, that's Black wealth, but it does not serve the Black community. And, when you say it looks like gentrification, I think part of what you're looking at is the beauty of African culture and what African life should look like and does look like. But we have this expectation everywhere we look around the world that all you see is poverty and destitution of African people, but African culture is what you're seeing being implemented through the Black Power Blueprint. Structurally, it's set up in a way that it's not about any individual. None of it is about any individual at all. And that's why the African Independence Workforce Program is so important, because people will be involved in it. They'll get training, they'll get skills brought back to them, many of which came from Africa in the first place. The institutions raise money to regenerate the process in the community. So when you see the Uhuru House that was built in 10 months, some of that money came from selling pies. Some of that money came from selling furniture. Some of that money came from an event like tonight where people go, I want to see that happen. And it's a challenge. That's why the reparations is so important, because the government in St. Louis does not want to see this happen. They don't. They have grants that they can give out. They give them to people who pretend to do something like this, but it is really for an individual. They won't support these programs. It's a people's movement. And it's creating things like the One Africa, One Nation Farmers Market, which gave away free food in the community, opened up a space where African workers could build a business. We looked at some statistics on that farmers market. Something like 32 Black businesses were built through that African farmers market. And in Philadelphia, there's 110 African people who participate in that market. So it's a culture buy-in for the people, and an economy that benefits the people. And the goal is feed, clothe, and house. And that's not as charity, but that African people have the ability to do that, to live those 18 extra years, to have healthcare, to have a medical center, to deliver their babies, and neither the mother or the baby dies. That's all economics. And that's what's being built. So I hope that helps.
So again, you talk about businesses. Are these profit-making businesses? I mean, that's capitalism to me, profit-making. So,
well, as I said, capitalism was built off of colonialism, and there's going to be somebody mentioned, I think Bakri Olatunji mentioned about the chairman calls this dual and contending power. It's a process. It's a process to overturn 600 years of capitalism living at the expense of African people. And so if an African person goes and sells their honey at a farmer's market and they keep the money for themselves, it might look like capitalism today, but it means that an African person is surviving, and that defeats capitalism.
yeah,
So,
that I can
it's a
see.
process. So.
That I can see, but maybe I'm not articulating well enough, but let me move on to something else.
Can I open it up to see if anyone else has a question? Just want to, we're gonna go about 10 more minutes, and then we'll have to stop if no one else has a question. Karpani, go ahead.
I was just wondering about the element of production. I've heard people talk about it sort of, but I'm having a hard time integrating it into the whole process of getting away from capitalism, which has the people doing the production, but the people not benefiting from it. The benefit goes to the top. So changing the way of production is what's the, how do I put it? What is the bottom line of that to make the change in production disappear capitalism? And is that a socialist economic base? Does that make any sense? The question, because I'm not understanding. So going my
Question
questions
I
on-
really wanted to ask. That's exactly what I wanted to ask.
Does that make sense, the question?
Uhuru, Wendy.
Yes, Uhuru, go ahead, Janine.
Uhuru, yeah, thank you for this event. Thank you everybody for the presentations, really fantastic. And thank you for the questions. It sounds like Janet and Carpani are asking similar questions. And I think what I want to say is that, you know, we're taught in school that capitalism means a certain thing, and that capitalism is the way, you know, supply and demand, and setting up your booth and setting your price. And like, there's all these things that we've been taught what capitalism is. And what Bakri was saying, and the party is saying, the Uhuru movement is saying, is that capitalism is, and Maureen was saying, is that colonialism, literally slavery and attacking and murdering and enslaving and raping and stealing, and, you know, that is all those resources that white people have went out into the world and brought them back to our own Europe, went all throughout, you know, the Americas, killed indigenous people, brought African people here, enslaved African people, 7-year life expectancy, took all their labor, the money, you name it. I mean, I can't even express how much we're talking about the amount of resources that white people have taken from everybody else on the planet. Then used it and, you know, set up a system to distribute it amongst ourselves, call it capitalism. But like, what is capitalism? Capitalism is the vast majority of the resources of the world coming into our pocketbooks, our life, to us. That is capitalism. And so anything that reverses the flow of resource from out of the white population, where it's ill-gotten, stolen, we don't have a right to it, it's not ours. If it goes back into the African community, indigenous populations, that is the reversal of the flow of resources. Now, in this case, this is the African People's Socialist Party. The Uhuru movement is the advanced detachment of the African working class, has set up a government to govern their own people. Resources going into the hands of the leadership of the African working class is when you're going to get real change, really the genuine success of overturning this relationship and really getting those resources back into the hands of the vast majority of the population where they've been stolen from. So that is, I hope that's helpful. It's like we kind of get spun out on these definitions of capitalism that we've been taught in high school and wherever, college or whatever. It's not, you know, just because somebody sets up a booth and sets a price and makes some money doesn't mean necessarily they're participating in capitalism. If white people are getting the resources of everybody else on the planet, that's capitalism. If the resources that are circulating in imperialism are going back into the African community under the leadership of the revolution, that is not capitalism. That is the dialectical opposite of capitalism. Those resources are going back into the hands of the leadership of the African working class, which is leading the struggle to take down this relationship and this social system. Hopefully that was helpful.
Uhuru, I see a hand from Jesse Neville and.
Yes. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have my camera on right now, but yeah, I just wanted to chime in as well. I really appreciate the discussion and what Rep. Bakri said, and Comrade Maureen and Janine, and the questions from Janet and Carpani. And I don't have a whole lot to add, but I did want to refer people to this piece that I just put in the chat from the Burning Spear newspaper. It's a presentation that the chairman gave at something, maybe it was the Congress. It's a series of presentations that he gave about this very question. And the piece is called Dual and Contending Power, the History and Struggle for Economic Development in the African People's Socialist Party. And in talking about like anti-colonial economic development, I remember the chairman made the point that, you know, Africa and African people around the world are not confronted with the contradiction of whether or not to have socialism or capitalism. They're confronted with development or no development. Yeah. And basically what they experience is no development. They've had, you know, what sometimes is referred to as underdevelopment, which is really exploitation, theft of resources, destruction of any capacity to benefit from their own labor and their own resources, and just abject, imposed impoverishment and starvation. And I mean, that's also true within the US, as we hear from some of the statistics and conditions that we heard about in this meeting tonight. And like, I think Rep. Bakri and Comrade Janine and Maureen were getting at, that, one of the things that the chairman has exposed with the theory of African internationalism is that the essence of capitalism is colonialism. So the essence of capitalism, all capitalist economic activity, rests upon the total colonial oppression and looting and pillage and theft of resources of Africa and African people. Therefore, you're not going to get to socialism just by trying to organize like workers' cooperatives or something like that. You're going to get to socialism first and foremost by overturning colonialism, which is the base of capitalism. And the road to overturning colonialism is the African people, led by the African working class, reclaiming control and power over their resources and their self-determination and their independence, and seizing control of the means of production. And the chairman refers to this thing where, like Marcus Garvey in the late 19 teens and 1920s, he was doing that. He was building businesses, and they were owned by African workers. And he quotes this white leftist who was attacking Garvey, saying, oh, well, he wasn't really, he should have been trying to get better wages and fighting for better conditions for Black workers and jobs and stuff like that, instead of being, running around trying to build businesses, because that's not really socialism. And the chairman was like, well, businesses in the control of the workers, when you have the means of production in the hands of the workers, that's called socialism. And that's what, so even though these programs are being built, I mean, obviously it's under capitalism. I mean, it's existing in a capitalist economy because that's still what prevails in the world, but it's not designed to just exist within the capitalist economy. It's designed to negate the capitalist economy and like erode and ultimately overturn the capitalist economy. And the fact that it's led by the African People's Socialist Party and it's led by and controlled by the African working class is what makes it something that's genuinely part of the creation of true socialism. So I think this is honestly a whole study unto itself. And definitely one worth having. They're very good questions. I definitely recommend reading that piece. And
Jesse, could you put it? I think you didn't actually put it in the chat. Maybe.
Oh, really? Okay. I thought I did.
Oh, sorry. My bad.
No problem.
There it is.
Anyway, I could
Great.
keep going on about this, but yeah, that's where I'll stop there. For real.
Awesome. I think these are really important questions. Do we have time for one more?
Could I, please?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so actually, thank you, Jesse. But I mean, businesses in control of the workers, that sounds like cooperatives. But in any case, the other thing I wanted to bring up was, and I don't know if Bakari, are you still there? Because you talked about great measure O and H. And I'm wondering whether you might, or the project might consider revising it to bring it back. I've been active with the Oakland Tenants Union, and also, so it wasn't clear to me whether that involved renters when you talked about the 25% API, or homeowners, or both. I mean, did that project involve homeowners?
Well, the we dropped over 300,000 pieces throughout the city of Oakland, some to homeowners, some to renters. But it involved every one of those 25,000 votes. It mainly came from the flatlands, but there were a lot of homeowners who participated and who voted for both of those measures in 1984 and 1986.
Right, but
And-
were those measures, was the target of those measures, the actual, what the,
Homeowners.
it was for homeowners?
Yeah, you had like for the,
Towns.
it was the initiative themselves, like Measure O divided the city up into 12 distinct districts. And we divided up those districts. There was a board for each district. And on those boards, there was representation of people who rented, representation of people who owned homes. And of those, and even of property owners, people couldn't own a certain amount of property. They couldn't own, I think, no more than 6 properties or something to sit on this board. And the people on that board had the ability of eminent domain. If there was a property left abandoned for 6 or more months, they had the ability for eminent domain to claim that particular property to house the homeless people in that particular district. So I would say that there was a cross representation of homeowners and renters and people who owned several properties within a particular district. And again, each district, the people would pay rent % of the median income of that particular district. If your district was low income, your rent was 25% of the median income of that district. So I just thought it was something unheard of at the time. It was something that, again, you saw a lot of opposition coming from major corporations, coming from the Oakland city government. At that time, Oakland was a majority Black city. It had a majority Black city council, something that the party has summed up as neo-colonialism, white power and blackface, and that we saw a lot of the notable Black churches upholding opposition to Measure O at that time. And all Measure O was about was something that you saw happening then. You see a greater need for it today. And I do agree with you. Yes, I think there needs to be some type of measure to really push back the state, to push back the colonial mode of production, to begin to build houses for people, to have, it shouldn't be a homeless person in the city of Oakland, but we have to look at what is the cause of that. And we look at the developers and we look at where the money goes. We talk about Willie Sutton, who was a bank robber in the 1930s or so, and people want to know why he robbed the bank, and he always said that's where the money is. We have to follow the money trail to understand why, why there's such a high level of homelessness right here in the city of Oakland. Why is it that 80% growth in homelessness happens here in Oakland? We have to look at the root cause of that and the people who had benefited. And it wasn't the tenants, it wasn't a lot of the homeowners. It was basically the big speculators, the big businesses, the corporations, and the politicians who benefit from this relationship.
And big landlords. Do you have the text still of those 2 measures? Because I'd really like to see that.
I think we might still have the community control of housing initiative somewhere.
Well, this has been a great discussion. I definitely do want to find those because I think I've learned so much. I knew some things about Measure O, but I think it was so thorough in its the way it was set up, and I think that's why it was with so little money and just like the footwork that happened led by the party, that it got that much support, and that it really threatened the white ruling class, and like you said, the neo-colonial government of Oakland, who were in the pockets of those white corporations, you know. So this has been a great discussion. I really appreciate our presenters here, Comrade Bakary, Comrade Maureen, Chair Jesse, and the people who came and asked great questions. And I just want to end, if that's okay with everyone, unless there's one last thing, by just calling on people to, get involved in the building, these last 9 days, getting the word out for the days of reparations to African people in Oakland. And I'm going to say unity through reparations. So unity through reparations.
Reparations.
Uhuru, everybody, have a great night and see you on October 2nd. Yes.
All right.
Thank you.